Greetings, comrades, and welcome to the official election Comrade Cast. You guys are going to be getting this on election day. Of course, we're going to have an election live stream. To be fair, this podcast is a little bit of a promotion for said live stream. I did want to get this episode out sooner than I have ended up doing so. But the reason I didn't is because I bought the Factorio Space Age DLC, and that just stole a week of my life. I just can't get it back. I just spent like a week staring at belts and building a giant factory. And I guess I've got really nothing to show for that except a kick-ass main bus. As a avowed anti-Italian, we cannot have spaghetti. Spaghetti is illegal. Anyway, so we're going to go through some of the big news. We're going to talk a little bit about what to expect in the live stream, and then we're going to go from there. I just realized, I think this is the first time you guys are seeing this shirt. I'm low on shirts. I don't like to wear this one, especially on the podcast, but it's a training shirt from the old academy. So as I promised you, we'd have a much more professional chart and dashboard for the stream. So this is what I've cooked up here. As you can see, Comrade's much more professional prediction chart. At the top, you'll see the states outlined in either red or blue for Democrat or Republican based on the predictions which I gave in the last episode. Based on what has happened in the last couple weeks, I don't think I'm going to change anything at all for those predictions. I'm pretty locked in for them. But when it comes to the election night results themselves, I do think that Jeb here might lose a little bit of ground. I think 538 electoral college votes might be a little high for him, but undoubtedly the God Emperor will ride once again. But yeah, obviously as time goes on, we'll be filling in the states with what the actual calls are and updating the chart. I should have done, if I had more time, I would have written something that I could automate all of this so I could just change a state and it would update the chart, but didn't have time for fancy crap like that. But on top of that, I'm bringing back some of the props I had from the midterm. I have some various props here which designate the momentum of the political parties. For the Republican side, I have a couple props to represent them gaining strength if they gain strength throughout the night. I, of course, have an elephant. And then the second tier is a football. And then the final tier is, of course, a gun. Then on the opposite side, I have some Democratic props. I have a zebra because the dollar store I went to didn't have a donkey. This was the closest I could find. We have a mermaid doll, one of my daughter's toys, and I guess it looks like Kamala. And then the final Democratic prop is a hammer, of course, representing the hammer and sickle. But I don't have a sickle, I just have a hammer. And then the final thing I'll reveal today, of course, I have more stuff, right? I've got all of my data streams lined up. I've got some filler things as well in case we're waiting for some results to come in. But one of the things that I talked to you guys a long time ago about how I went and I studied a bunch of cybersecurity practices and got some certificates and whatnot. And one of the things that is part of what they teach you is what they call open source intelligence gathering, which is gathering intelligence from obviously places that aren't locked down, that are publicly available. And through learning about open source intelligence, one of the resources I found was this site called EarthCam. There are quite a few sites like this which have various cameras set up all over the world. And I've selected, and not just from this site, I've got a couple other sites too. And obviously this is not creepy at all, but I've got a couple streams set up for some of these various cameras across swing states so that we can maybe get a little bit of inclination of what's happening, see if we can see people lining up, if we can see anything that might be interesting or valuable. Right now, it's weird. It's a live stream within, I guess it wouldn't be a live stream within a live stream, but it's a live stream within a video. We're just sitting here watching people go by in New Orleans, Louisiana, live. I don't know, because we can. Here's another camera live from Gaylord, Michigan. It's a snowman. Well, not a real snow. Cardboard one. So anyway, my point here is it's going to be awesome. I'm super excited for the live stream. Like I said, I told you guys last time, I love doing election results as they come in. I love watching the election results as they come in. So yeah, it's going to be great. I got a ton of stuff lined up and I can't wait. But with that out of the way, let's move into the meat and potatoes of the episode. And we're going to, of course, talk about the first poll and of course, we're going to talk about this poll, which came out. And I'm sure you guys, if you've been following along, know what we're going to talk about. This poll, which recently came out and just blew everybody's nips right off. That is, of course, the Ann Seltzer poll for Iowa. So to give some context, this poll itself is regarded as one of the best in the country. It's considered to be very accurate and usually has found trends that are brewing within voter sentiment before other polls have. The first instance, though, that set her on the map was her calling Barack Obama's overwhelming caucus victory in 2008. No other pollsters at the time were even considering that Barack Obama might be the one to come in and clinch that. If he hadn't won Iowa in that fashion, right, it's very unlikely that he becomes president of the United States. So obviously, it was a pretty key result. But beyond that, they also detected the Trump wave in 2016. For example, most pollsters in 2016 had Hillary Clinton winning in Iowa. However, the Seltzer poll at the time was showing a different trend. It was showing that it was going to be pretty comfortably a Trump state. And then come 2016, it was comfortably a Trump state. And then in 2020, she once again predicted that Iowa would be more red than the polls were saying. In 2020, the polls didn't have Biden up in Iowa, really, but they had Trump just scraping by with the state. But he ended up winning it comfortably in concordance with the Seltzer poll. And then, of course, this one that comes out in 2024, and as I said, blows our nips off, which shows Kamala Harris leading in the state of Iowa by 3 points. And I should be fair here. When I was doing my research on Seltzer and everything like that, they have missed one call. There was one call that they got wrong. I can't remember the year, but it was a governor race within Iowa. And they called Democrats winning by 3 points, but the Republicans ended up winning that gubernatorial race, as the nerds say. They ended up winning that gubernatorial race by 2 points. So they don't have a 100% solid track record, but it's extremely good. And many people consider Seltzer to be one of the, if not the top polling firm in the country. But what they're detecting here is really interesting to me, and it's reflected what I feel may happen on this election night. But one of the reasons why I think Kamala Harris is going to win, I guess today, because you guys are seeing it today, is because I think that Democrats are actually being underpolled in this election, which is a significant shift from what we've seen in the last two elections. But we all have to remember 2022, and I think this election is going to be a real question, and people have said this before. Is this going to be a 2022 electorate that shows up, or is this going to be a 2020 electorate that shows up? And effectively, ever since Roe v. Wade has been overturned, Democrats have consistently overperformed their polling numbers and consistently overperformed in special elections. So these are some pretty interesting indicators that now the ball may have switched, right? The ball may have switched, that pollsters have done too much course correcting to try and find these Trump voters that they weren't getting last time. And as a result, they're now missing Democratic voters. But obviously, not all agree with me on this sentiment. But one of the things that is really interesting to me about this particular poll is that we are seeing the 55 and older demographic actually move substantially more towards the Democratic camp, taking up a full 51% for the 51 and older cohort. Kamala Harris is leading, although not as much as you would think, amongst younger than 35-year-olds. And then in the middle, 35 to 55, Donald Trump has a 8-point lead. But again, this huge lead among seniors is very strange because usually seniors are a pretty solid Republican base. They usually end up voting more right than younger people. So to see Kamala Harris with such a commanding lead is strange. And the reason why this lead exists, given the data that we have, is because senior women in particular are breaking hard for Kamala. We've been talking about the political gender gap in the younger generation. Maybe it's happening in the older generation too, or starting to happen in the older generation too, because we are seeing way more senior women start to go into Kamala's camp than were ever close to Donald Trump's camp. So yeah, this poll is definitely interesting, and a lot of people are pulling it apart. Of course, Republicans are trashing it. Democrats are elated. Well, some of them are. I've seen a lot of them even, they're like, we're not going to win Iowa. And probably not. But Democrats are anywhere close to winning Iowa, it's a really bad night for Republicans. It's a really bad night. But to go into the point that I was making earlier, that a lot of people don't agree with me, that Democrats and Democrat-leaning cohorts are being underpolled in this election, let's move to, I actually got some Canadian sources here, 2 Canadian sources of people who disagree with me. One, this is from the Toronto Star, and can't read this because apparently they must have moved it. It must have been free for everybody to read for a little bit of time, but now it's moved behind a paywall. And I'm sorry, Jamie Watt, your readers aren't going to pay to listen to why you think Donald Trump is going to win the U.S. presidential election. And the reason is because the Toronto Star, I would say it's probably the most left-leaning outlet in Canada. Well, there's some smaller ones like The Tree and stuff like that. But by and large, I would say that in terms of large media outlets, the Toronto Star is probably the most left-leaning in the country. So to have one of their columnists come out and say, hey, I think Trump is going to be the victor in this election, let's just say it rubbed the readers of the Toronto Star the wrong way. I don't know if we're not subscribers or whatever. Yeah, apparently we're not allowed to. Oh, that's because I turned off JavaScript because they say, oh, you got to fucking pay for this. Yeah, and it just kicks me out to the fucking front page. What a bunch of fucking assholes. I hate that shit. I hate it so much. Anyway, so we're obviously not going to read the article. But as I was saying, he got ripped apart by his readers in the comments section. They were really tearing him a new asshole over that piece. But listen, I don't want to stare at this fucking guy's face. But one of the points that he brought up in that article for why he thinks Donald Trump is going to win is because historically, Trump voters have been underrepresented in the polls, and he thinks that this is going to repeat once again. And another YouTuber, maybe I'll pull up his channel here. He's another YouTuber who I follow. He's like a smaller political guy, but he does Canadian politics and some other American politics and whatnot. So yeah, shout out here to the Great Canadian Bagel, another Canadian political YouTuber. And he believes that Trump as well will win the election. And he has a similar reasoning to the Toronto Star columnist, which is that Trump voters are underrepresented in the polls, and therefore they are going to be overrepresented on election night. And he references the shy Tory effect, which is, if you guys don't know, people who are right-leaning, generally speaking, it doesn't necessarily have to always be right-leaning, but people who are right-leaning tend to not want to vocalize their opinions because they're shy of getting blowback. I personally think that this is an antiquated idea. I think that time is past. You guys know I live here in Canada too, obviously. And Donald Trump is an extremely unpopular man here. Very unpopular. Even in where I live, the most conservative province of Alberta, he would still lose to Kamala Harris in an actual election because one thing that usually happens, I should check actually if they've done it this year, but usually every year they do like an informal poll of all the Canadian provinces in terms of who they would vote for in an election. And it's almost always the Democratic candidate, even here in Alberta. Anyway, as I was saying, my point here is that even in a country where Donald Trump is not popular, he still has supporters. And let me tell you guys, those supporters are very enthusiastic to tell you about Donald Trump. They're not shy at all. They don't care about getting any kind of blowback. In fact, if you give them blowback, which is something that I, on very frequent occasions do, they like it. They want it, right? They want the fight, and that's fine because I love the fight too. So I don't think that is going to be a factor this time around. I think the Trump supporters out there are loud and proud, and they are not hiding it anymore in any way, shape, or form. I've always found it weird, and that's maybe because there's been more cycles where Republicans have been underpolled, but everyone seems to forget 2022. Everyone was like, oh, the red wave's coming. It's coming, guys. Didn't come. Didn't materialize, and Democratic candidates and prospects ended up being underrepresented in that election cycle. And not only that, the candidates who were affiliated with Trump himself, or closely affiliated with Trump himself, ended up doing substantially worse than just generic Republicans. So again, like I mentioned, I think that's going to be a real question of how much 2022 is going to affect 2024. So let's move back to our benchmark here at Real Clear Politics and look at our final analysis. And this will bring me into another point that I want to make about why I think Democrats are probably being underpolled in this election. Is a lot of discussion has been made about what people call herding. And if you guys don't know, herding is when all the pollsters, they come together and decide, you know what, I don't really know what's going on. Seems like it's a tie. We're just going to call it a tie to make sure that we don't piss anybody off. And we can see right here in the polls, it's tough not to see something like that because we have tie. For the last three ones were ties. Trump +2, Harris +4. Probably the biggest outlier here. Two more ties, Harris +2, Harris +1, Harris +2, Trump +3. Yeah, so you guys get the point. Every poll has come out and said, oh, it's a tie, it's a tie. And Nate Silver made the point that this effectively, for all these polls to be ties, and all of the swing states to be in such close margins, to be consistently tied in all these polls, it had to be like a 1 in 7 trillion chance of this actually happening. And I think that the Iowa poll may show us a little bit of glimpse in terms of that, yeah, the herding is actually happening and people have given up figuring out what exactly might end up being the case when election night rolls around. And yeah, so we can see now Real Clear Politics has a literal tie, dead heat, dead even right now. And then in terms of our states here, we're all very close. The only ones that are above a 2-point margin are Arizona, and that's it. Yeah, that's the only one above a 2-point margin is Arizona. So all of these states are well within the margin of error. Again, it's very unlikely statistically that this would happen. So I think there's a pretty solid case that, yeah, there's some sort of herding going on, and the pollsters are hedging their bets in a very real way. So the last thing, I'll spend the last part of the show going over some of the major plot points which have happened in the last week or so, which if I had done this episode a week ago, I would be much less enthusiastic about Kamala's chances of winning. There was a while where I thought that like Trump, and you can see here in the Real Clear Politics average, right, you can see that he finally overtakes Kamala really for the first time in the averages. Just recently appears to have a pretty big surge. But that all ended at the Madison Square Gardens rally in New York, where among some very bizarre moments, you have Donald Trump like pretending to jerk off a microphone that's making the rounds. But the big thing is they had a comedian come on out there. This is from Fortune, and this kind of echoes some of what I've been thinking in terms of this Madison Square Garden rally, that it really started to drop for Donald Trump's chances. So again, in this rally, one of the major points is that he has this comedian come out there and make an offhanded comment, right? A lot of people on my camp have been saying that it was probably 100% meditated. I don't think, like, you guys have to understand the Donald Trump campaign mentality. Things like editors, content managers, people who may try and trim around the edges of what someone wants to say, those aren't really part of the Trump campaign. Those aren't really part of Trump's political machinery. Like, and that is like one of my big things about Trump himself is that up until January 6, 2021, I thought that Donald Trump was just like another basic bitch Republican president. The only real difference between him and a guy like George Bush was the style. George Bush had an editing staff that would edit his speeches. Now, Donald Trump doesn't have that. But in terms of actual policy, there was very little difference. Then January 6th comes, and that was like a real eye-opening moment for me. This guy's seriously dangerous. This is a real serious situation, and he's got to go. So yeah, I don't think this was a coordinated, planned out comment. It was just this comedian riffing or whatever you want to say. And in the middle of his riff, he goes, they have a floating island of garbage in the ocean. It's called Puerto Rico or something like that. I think that's the gist of the joke. And yeah, it's a trash tier joke. Pun very much intended. And the thing is, I wouldn't really give two shits about this kind of offhanded comment because people say and do crazy things at Trump rallies all of the time. There just happens to be a pretty substantial portion of Puerto Rican voters living in Pennsylvania. And this kind of speculation really started to unravel. And then the wheels started coming off more and more after this Madison Square Garden rally. People started thinking, wait, this is like a bigger deal than we may have thought before. But yeah, Trump had to come out and say that the guy was an affiliated party or whatever, and they had to walk things back. And yeah, it looked really bad. It did not look good for Trump. And then since it just felt like Kamala has really had the momentum come back into her step and come back into her campaign. And obviously you couldn't have, because I think a big part of who wins an election is who has the momentum on voting day. It's tough to gauge like where the momentum is going a lot of the time. But when you have that momentum brewing, it seems to actually carry through to election day in a greater force, if that makes sense. I remember this was the Alberta election. Was it 2012 or 2011? Where it was the Progressive Conservative Party against the Wild Rose Party, who is a more right-wing party here. And all of the polls had the Wild Rose winning going into election day. But as election day started to get closer and closer, the Progressive Conservatives started to gain momentum. And then when election day actually hit, the momentum that the Progressive Conservatives had carried them through to a majority government. So I've always believed momentum is important. And like I said, about a week ago, I would have said the momentum is in Trump's favor. But this rally has definitely shifted things. This Iowa poll has shifted things. And I can see that the Democratic supporters out there are getting hopeful. They're getting excited that this might actually be a good night. This might be a really good night. So those are all extremely positive signs, in my opinion. So I guess this was the October surprise. I predicted my last episode that there wouldn't really be an October surprise. I guess they're saying that he surprised himself. And especially if this comes to fruition and ends up being a pretty sizable turning point in the Trump campaign, then yeah, it would actually constitute an October surprise, I think. I almost feel like the bigger surprise, though, was the Seltzer poll. That was the November surprise. And like I said, that poll came out like at just the right time to really invigorate Democrats, and they're excited. But obviously, counting your chickens before they hatch is a very detrimental practice, and no one should take anything for granted. I would be saying this. I was actually planning to have some kind of lecture in this vein to Trump supporters, because I've been noticing a ton of confidence in the Trump camp prior to the Madison Square Garden rally. They were feeling very confident. And I was thinking, like, you guys, this is going to be a near run thing. Like, the chances of you guys losing tonight are 50% probably. So the kind of confidence that you have, definitely not warranted. And you shouldn't take anything for granted. But in this case, I think that the Democrats' confidence, yeah, it's a little bit more warranted. But the important point is you can't take anything for granted when it comes to a political campaign. Right? It's not over until it's over. You got to get out there and you got to vote for whatever candidate you want to win. Because if you don't, why are you wasting everybody's time? And I know for me personally, I hate voting on actual election day. I can't remember. Actually, no, there was the last Edmonton municipal election was the last time I voted on election day. I always think voting on election day is for plebs. You should vote in advance, particularly if you're serious about politics. You should always be voting in advance. My personal preferred voting method is in-person advance voting. And the reason for that is because I've usually made up my mind long before voting day. And it's just so much faster, right? It's so much faster. You get in, you get out. You don't have to wait in line. You don't have to sit there and make small talk with all the weirdos in front of you and behind you. And advance voting is especially important if you've ever volunteered on a campaign or done some political campaign work. They will basically force you to do advance voting because when it comes to your candidate's election day, they don't want you to spend any of your time or resources at the polling booth. They want you to be marshaling your efforts in something like, one thing that would be my favorite thing to do on election day is volunteer to drive people to the voting booth. We'd identify our voters and we'd identify maybe voters that would have trouble getting to the polling booth. So we'd phone them up and say, hey, you want to ride? And then I'd show up and drive them there. But they might want you to do something like phone banking and making sure your known voters have gotten out there and voted. And then after the fact, you'll probably do some scrutineering, which is another thing that I actually really enjoy, which is that you and your opposing parties will go to a polling booth and the elections worker they'll start pulling out the ballots. and they'll show you every ballot, and then they'll read out one for Kamala Harris or whatever. And then you as a scrutineer, you look at the ballot, make sure it's all good. And then you have a tally that you mark down, right? So this poll, we have one for Kamala, and then they pull out the next vote and they show it to everybody and they say one for Donald Trump. And you put on your little tally, one for Donald Trump. And then obviously you go through that. And then when everything's over, all three of you or more, or however many people are at the polling booth, will check to make sure we all have the same numbers. If we don't have the same numbers, we're going to count it all over again and all over again until we ensure that everybody's on the same page. Then once you have some polls counted, because usually, at least, I'm not sure if it works substantially different in America, right? But you go into this big room after the election where they've started to gather all of the different polling boxes from all the different polling places across your region. And you'll come into this, usually like a gymnasium or something. And then, they'd have the table with every individual election worker with their polling box that is sitting out waiting for you. And they can't open it and they can't start counting until they have at least 2 scrutineers there to watch the voting unfurl. So then once you've done a couple polls, you'll phone up your campaign and be like, hey, we have won in this poll, we've lost in this poll, we've lost in this one, we've won in this one. Here are the numbers, update them to the board, click. And that's how campaigns will get a much faster picture if they're winning or losing in comparison to the general public. So anyway, that's Papa Comrade's story time about what it's like to work for a political campaign on election day. Personally, as fun as it can be to be part of a political campaign, I think the live stream we're going to have tomorrow is going to be a lot more fun than that. So again, I'm looking very much forward to that. And I think I've pretty much exhausted everything I have to say on the election. In one sense, I'll be happy when it's all over because we've been talking about this for quite some time. It's always nice and you have this catharsis when it's finally all over and you can finally not care about American politics so much. The only thing is it really does suck for a politically oriented show like mine, where after the election, people really tune out of politics for at least a year and they don't even start thinking about it until the midterms start coming up again. But that's okay because I've got a large variety of topics that I've been wanting to get to, a little bit more in the cultural realm, the philosophical realm, that I'll finally get the opportunity to talk about once big ones all said and done. So anyway, with that, I'm going to wrap up our episode. I want to thank you guys for watching. This has been the Comrade, signing off for now. And until next time, you guys take care.